she did that, and he would even get the genders wrong. He'd be like, and then she killed 2 women or something like that. And I mean, it was just completely, off from what had actually happened. And he had himself being an action star throughout of it. He had himself saying, no, we shouldn't kill anybody, and Caril going, oh, yes, we should. Changed the story to all these different ridiculous things. My grandfather then, of course, as a result of all this, became so convinced that Caril was innocent that he started started really believing she was innocent, that it wasn't just a matter of, okay, I'm going to represent this client, but rather he became very passionately involved in it and felt very strongly that she was innocent and that, she needed somebody to really speak out for her. So he continued to represent her. I mean, he represented her through a whole trial. She was still found guilty, was given life imprisonment, and so but he stayed with her for 18 years until he managed to get her out of prison on parole, and never paid a single penny for it, because first he refused to take the amount that they were supposed to pay him, because he was just so insulted by the way the police had handled the whole thing, and then he never charged her a single dime for the whole thing. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say it's important also to at the start of the whole thing, you talked about how, or I actually mentioned, and I know you talked about it in the past and in your book, is that she didn't even realize she was being charged, because we're talking, 8 years before Miranda warnings and Miranda rights.
Right.
So, how would she even know?
Right. A 14-year-old child. I mean, basically the police went to her and started asking her about what happened, which is, you'd think would just be normal. I mean, if you were with somebody who went around killing a bunch of people, the police you help the police catch them, and then the police, take both you and he in. The police start asking you questions. Of course, you're just going to go, yeah, well, this happened. You see yourself as a witness, not as, an accomplice. And there were certain times where they kind of pointed at, well, we talked about what would happen if she was charged, and and it's like, yeah, but you never specifically said you're being charged and here's what could happen to you. But yeah, like you say, there were no rights, and a lot of those rights happened during the time. That's actually, to me, one of the things that also makes this story fascinating is during the appeals process when my father got involved. That's when a lot of these cases, like the Miranda case, came along, and the law really changed during the course of this, and a lot of them actually related to this case.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a historic case. I know this is one of those things, growing up that you didn't realize the significance of it until later on, but it's one of those things you look back and you just realize how important this whole thing was, and that your grandfather was an important player in all this. Can you do me a favor? And I know a lot about your grandfather just from research of my own, but for our listeners, can you talk a little bit about your grandfather and the type of man that he was?
Sure. And yeah, by the way, I hope that I'm being detailed enough. I'm trying to summarize things, and suddenly, every now and then, I realize that I know a lot of this stuff so well that I assume everybody else does, and I skip important parts. So feel free to tell me if I'm skipping something important here. But yeah, like my grandfather was, it's just like you say. I took the story for granted. I mean, he was just the funny grandpa who would slurp his spaghetti, or who taught me how to slurp spaghetti, and would watch Nebraska Cornhusker games, and was usually very quiet, but then every now and then would get sort of to riling the kids up or the grandkids up, because he enjoyed seeing us getting kind of nuts or whatever. Didn't really see anything beyond that until, I grew up, and unfortunately I really didn't truly grow to appreciate him and his involvement in this until after he had died. But he was the kind of person who, the first chapter I begin with the story that my uncle told me about, where because he would only go to church when Christmas fell on a Saturday, because he was Seventh-day Adventist, and so that's when church was for them. But when he did go, there was one year when he went with this uncle of mine, and my uncle just heard him grumbling during the thing, because they were giving out these awards for good service awards. And my uncle, who knew that my grandfather was very much somebody who believed in doing good service for people, and he was always doing things for people and stuff like that, he was like, why are you upset by this? I think you'd like this. And my grandfather muttered, you should just do something because it's the right thing to do, not because you're going to get an award for it. And that's the kind of person he was. I mean, there were things at his funeral. There were people who just showed up who said he was paying up my rent. I would have been kicked out on the street if it hadn't been for him, and he just never told any of us. There were times where, actually, if you've ever read or seen To Kill a Mockingbird, that character is so much like our grandfather. My father often wondered about that because he just was so similar to him. One of the things that was it was a very similar thing from the book or from the character of Atticus Finch. My grandfather is that my grandfather sometimes, if he thought that somebody couldn't afford to pay for his or her services, that he would take barter. He would take items from them or something. He would be like, well, you're raising some pigs, aren't you? How about, give me one of your pigs or something like that. And then he'd give the pig to one of his children as a pet or something like that, because he didn't necessarily have a use for it. But it's just he sort of felt this, tie to the community, to help people, and all that sort of thing. Very quiet, very much to himself, but which you don't expect to be like with a lawyer. But I've actually learned more and more, especially recently, that once he would get passionate about something, then he would get very verbal about it, and that's where it really came out, like in the courtroom and that sort of thing.
So to kind of go back to Caril Ann Fugate, to the best you can surmise, at what point did she even realize that she was being charged?
When she really realized what it was when she was meeting with my grandfather. He went in, he had been appointed to be her lawyer, and so he goes in to talk with her, and she apparently just started talking to him like he was in somebody else with the police or something like that, and started telling him the different things that Charlie had done. And so my grandfather just went, okay, well, that's great, Caril, but we really need to find out, we really need to prepare your defense. And she's just like, well, why do I have to work on my defense? Charlie's the one being charged. He's the one who did everything. And my grandfather was like, well, yeah, but they're charging you. And that was when, because you can imagine telling a small 14-year-old child this, she just kind of didn't, she didn't really understand. And she was like, why would all that? But it was quite, quite upsetting for her.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess a lot of people, I'll go ahead and get to the question before we go too far into it. And I know a lot of people always ask this because they don't know the full nature of this case. So I'll go ahead and get into it so we can just get it out of the way.
All right.
People's question is always, if Caril Ann Fugate didn't participate, why didn't she leave? Why did she had a weapon at certain points in time? Why didn't she use it? That type of thing. I get it, right, but I think we should probably explain for the listeners.
Yeah, exactly, and that's what I'm starting to realize. I guess I didn't go as much into it. For those people who don't know the story so much, they like I say, he showed up at her house. She goes home. They disappear for a period of time, and then there are a bunch of bodies in their wake. And then when she's found, they go after Charlie, but they do find her during her her own story of it involves times when when he was taking a nap, or when there were a couple times when she had a gun in her hand, and it was even a time when she pointed at one of the victims and said, "Go ahead, follow Charlie to where where he's going." So people point at that and say, "Hey, well, why didn't she either try to escape? Why didn't she use the gun? All sort of thing." Now, the case of the gun, actually, there were two times when she had one. One was before she had seen him kill anybody. And, it's just there's somebody who's shown up, and yes, logically, there's certain points where you'd go, hey, why don't you use that? Why don't you, or at least tell the person to do something? And those are valid questions, and those are the questions where when somebody uses it, I'm like, okay, that makes some sense. You do have to take into account the fact that she's 14 years old, the fact that she's not, completely using her logic at all times. And then after the only other time that she had a gun in her hand was after she had seen several people killed. He handed one to her, and she didn't use it. But it's in retrospect, looking back, based on the evidence, it's better for her case that she didn't, because it turns out it was jammed and unloaded. I think she kind of knew it was unloaded because it was a shotgun and he had used both of the shots. But if she had tried to use it, it would have, even if it was loaded, it would have just gone click, and he just simply would have shot her and probably, some other people, around him that they were near at the time. But anyway, and then there were some times where, okay, well, there wasn't somebody around. Why didn't she escape at that time or whatever? And what my grandfather always claimed was that she was that she was psychologically kidnapped at that point, that she, couldn't escape in her mind. And that is also exemplified by there was one other person along the road, or there was one time when they were in this house where they had a
Still there, Jeff? I think Jeff might have run into some phone issues. Vic, can you hear me okay? Vic?
Yep, I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think Jeff's phone might have run into issues. Jeff, if you can hear me still, call back in because you were on the verge. Yeah, he's going to call right back. Anyway, so so basically he's setting it up for us as, the legend or whatever's been told is that, this was the modern day Bonnie and Clyde from the night, well, maybe not modern day, but 60 years ago modern day. And what you've been told about this maybe isn't true because there's other facts to it that people have just not talked about. And because it gets ingrained, just like the Elizabeth Bathory story, in the public consciousness, and people just spread the same thing. I mean, Vic, how many times do you talk to people about cases like this, and they just don't know what they're talking about? They think they do, but they don't.
So, it's like an everyday thing.
Yeah, exactly. All right, Jeff's back on the line. He's just trying to get logged in here, and he'll be here. Hey, Jeff. How you doing? Sorry about that. I guess we ran into phone issues. But anyway, anyway, you're continuing your story about Caril and just kind of her, well, I guess, opportunities there, and her the way this took a mental toll on her, and that she was she had no choice in her own mind at this point.
Yeah, well, I mean, like my grandfather, his view was that, she was sort of mentally kidnapped, and this was exemplified through one of the victims named Clara Ward when they were in her house. This was a middle-aged, 40-something-year-old woman who she was away from Charlie for something like 40 minutes or something like that. Upstairs, there's big windows, even a working telephone, and yet she didn't use them. Now, does that mean that she was involved in the murder? Does that mean that she was complicit in helping him, that sort of thing? No, of course not. There's no way that anybody would accuse her of doing that, especially because she ended up being killed by Charlie. But that's the thing that's what fear does to you. No matter how much you say, oh, I'd be the hero, I'd do that, I'd do this, fear ends up taking hold of you in ways that you don't expect it to. And this is especially when someone's a child. And this has come out a number of times since then. I mean, one of the most recent and most obvious examples is Elizabeth Smart, who was with her captors for months, far longer than Caril was, and, had, in retrospect, there were moments where she could have escaped, but in her mind she was just so, captive to him. And, I mean, in Caril's case, for the most part, there really weren't many times when she could have escaped. When they were on the road, that whole thing happened over the course of about 48 hours. So he was on her just about the entire time. And when they were at her home before they left, that's something I guess I didn't explain at the beginning for those who don't know the story too well. When she came home, found Charlie there, they stayed at her home for something around a week. They basically disappeared there, and then it was about a week later that they left. And it was family members kept wondering, well, where they were, and would go to the door and ask what was going on. Caril would always show up and say, "Everyone's sick with the flu, go away." But she would have her hand at her mouth, and she'd be pointing to the side, like something's over there. But she would just sort of have her hand by her mouth, like she was covering it and coughing or whatever. And anyway, what her claim was that Charlie would tie her down at night while he was sleeping. And sure enough, when she was found, she had red marks on her arms where she would have been tied down. That revealed that. So she really didn't have very many opportunities. There were admittedly some, but at those times, again, when you look at other people around there, other people didn't run when they knew what was going on and had the chance. And we're expecting more from this 14-year-old child than we are from older people, that sort of thing.
That's a good point too, and I need to again reiterate that point. 14 years old.
Right.
Seeing, multiple people murdered, doesn't know what's going on with her family. And, whenever I think about this case, and I've thought about it from all angles, I just continue to try, and it's not easy to put myself in the shoes of a 14-year-old. You know, even in myself as a 14-year-old, we're talking, you know,